Our next topic is fair division in divorce. And fair division in divorce we're going to use in the particular case when we have a whole number of objects that we're dividing between two people. So first I'm going to outline the method that we'll use. Each person in the divorce is going to assign a worth to each item that they have to divide, each item that they have to allocate to a person. And each person is going to add up all the worths that they assign to objects to find the perceived total worth. And then their, quote, fair share is going to be half that amount. A whole bunch of states require that any divorce agreement be a 50-50 split. Any state that's a no-fault state for divorce, you want to ensure that each person in the divorce gets exactly half. Now, for each object, we look at which person valued it higher, which person gave the higher bid on that object, and then we're going to give it to them, and we're going to ask them to pay half of what they valued that object at. The reason they pay half the price is that they're already entitled to half of the value of that object, so they should only have to pay the other half in order to have it as their own. Next, we give the other person in the couple half of what that other person bid on the object. And since the other person bid less than the first person, there's going to be leftover money. And at the end of everything, we split that extra money evenly between both people. Now, I said give the object to the person who bid more, but it is possible that both people bid exactly the same on an object, in which case you could just flip a coin to decide who gets the object. So we'll run through an example now, starting at step 1, where we have people assign worths to the objects. So object 1 is a car. Spouse A thinks that the car is worth $16,000 and spouse B thinks that the car is worth $20,000. And you'll rarely find agreement on these objects because one person might have a sentimental attachment to an object that makes them value it more highly. Or just like with Blue Book value on a car, you have to decide, is it in good condition? Is it in fair condition? And different people have different ideas about what that means. And so it's very unlikely that both people would value a car at exactly the same amount. Next, we have a house. The house spouse A thinks is worth $180,000, spouse B thinks is worth $160,000. And then in this example, I'm also going to include bank accounts just so we can see what it's like when we have something tied. Now, what I did is I took all 3 of the bids that people made. For example, spouse A bid a total of $256,000, so half of that is $128,000. That is what spouse A believes is their fair share. Spouse B bid a total of $240,000, and so spouse B believes that they need to receive $120,000 worth of objects in order to have a fair split. So I'm going to assign the objects to people based on the bids. Spouse B wins the car because they bid higher at $20,000. Spouse A wins the house at $180,000, and then I flip a coin between B and A for the bank accounts. $60,000 goes to spouse B, but we're going to see that because it's cash and because they bid the same amount, these objects really don't matter much, and in fact, in all the rest of the examples that we do, both in homework and on quizzes and exams, we won't ever have ties, just because they end up not being interesting to the result. We next see that spouse A won a total of $180,000 worth of bids, meaning the bids on that house. Spouse A only has a right to half of that house, so they need to pay $90,000 in cash. Likewise, spouse B won a total of $80,000 of bids because they won $20,000 car and $60,000 bank account. And again, they're only entitled to half, so they pay out $40,000. So a total of $130,000 is getting paid out as these items are getting allocated, but the important thing is about how much each spouse is now taking in. So if we look at spouse B, Spouse B, the only object they didn't receive is the house, and they believe the house is valued at $160,000. That means they wanted $80,000 for their half of the house. So even though spouse A paid $90,000, spouse B is only going to take $80,000 as a 50% settlement on that house. Likewise, spouse B paid out $40,000 for the car and the bank accounts, but if you think about how much spouse A thinks they're worth, spouse A thinks that their half of the car is $8,000 and their half of the bank account is $30,000. So together, spouse A only believes that they are entitled to $38,000 as half of the value of the car and the bank accounts. In that case, we have what is known as extra. This is sometimes also called leftover. Sometimes people refer to it as the kitty, K-I-T-T-Y. So we generated $10,000 extra from, and I use a capital K for 1,000, $10,000 extra from the settlement on the house, and we generated another $2,000 extra from the settlement on the car. We didn't generate any extra on the settlement of the bank account because everybody agrees that $60,000 is worth $60,000, and so each person wants $30,000 of that. There's no leftovers. So if you remember, our last step is to divide up the extra between them, and that's $12,000, and so they get $6,000 each extra. And that is the amount that they believe that they are getting that is more than the fair share. So for example, right after this point, spouse A believes that they are getting a fair deal. They won $180,000 worth of bids. They paid out half of that, $90,000. They took in what they believe is a fair value on the other two objects, $38,000. But then, at the end, they get $6,000 extra. Likewise, spouse B won their bids, paid half, got half of the worth of all the objects they didn't get, and then gets this $6,000 extra from each. So next I'd like to show you a second approach to doing this problem. It's really actually the same thing, but it just takes one item at a time instead of looking at all of spouse A's bids and all of spouse B's bids separately. We're going to look at one object at a time. So let's start with the car. The car, spouse B won for $20,000. So for the car, we say B pays $10,000 because they have to pay half of the value of the car, half of the value that they put on the car. Now A thinks that the car is worth $16,000 and they don't get it, so A expects to receive $8,000 as a 50-50 split on the car. So B pays 10, A takes 8, leaving us 2K extra. We do the same thing with the house. On the house, A will pay $90,000. B will take $80,000 as half the value. And we have 10K extra, 10K left over as a difference between what A paid and what B took. And then finally, we split up the cash money, but since they had the same bid, they just both take 30 and there's no extra. So there's no extra on that one, but we do get $12,000 extra total, which is the sum. Let me just show you where that $12,000 came from. $12,000 extra total, that's the sum of the $10,000 extra for the house and the $2,000 extra for the car. $10,000 extra total, we then divide that evenly and they get $6,000 extra each. And when I ask you in a homework question, how much more than a fair share do they each believe that they're getting? That's this. This is the number I'm looking for. They each got $6,000 beyond what they thought was a 50-50 split. So that's how much each one of them thinks they're getting that is more than a fair share. Now, as long as at least one of their bids differs in value, each spouse will believe they got slightly more than half the goods. This is an extra good thing to have in divorce, especially a contentious divorce. Each person wants to feel like they got something over on the other person. And if they can both feel like they got more than 50%, that is excellent. There are some problems with this fair division algorithm. I mean, there are problems with most ways to divide objects. One example here is, what if the winning spouse didn't have money to give? Then the item might have to be sold and just the cash proceeds of the item would have to be divided, or possibly one of the spouses could go on a payment plan to pay that money back to the other spouse over the course of a long time. But it's not always possible to just say, oh, I think my house is worth $180,000. Here, I'm going to write you a check for $90,000. That's not always something that people are able to do. We also know that each person is assigning worths to these objects, separately from the other spouse. But what if you know that your spouse particularly values something and you are feeling like you'd like to hurt them, and so you give something a really high bid, not because you value it, but just because you want to keep it out of the hands of your spouse? Well, both spouses are going to have to be aware of that, and so for each object, you have to go into it being willing to bid high enough on an object so that if you lose it, you still feel like it's worth it to you to only get half of the dollar amount on that. So if one person has, a collection of some sort, normally those aren't worth a lot on the open market. You can't sell your Beanie Babies and get any money for them anymore. But if one of the spouses particularly values that, they're going to have to put a bid on it that makes them okay with losing it if their partner bids higher just to piss them off. And then the last question is, should kids be included? Kids are not, in general, calculated into a 50-50 asset split when divorce proceedings happen around the country. But informally, kids are often included in divorce proceedings, and people will say, okay, you can have the boat if I get the kids, or I will give you this part of this retirement account if I get one extra day a week with the kids. So that often informally, away from a judge, kids are negotiated, and access to children is negotiated along with the rest of the monetary assets that a couple may be dividing. I presented two approaches here to solving fair division in divorce. One was to look at the spouse's bids at each point and add those all up. The other was to look at each object individually and calculate how much is paid out and how much is taken in for each object, and then to calculate the extra on both of those. I would encourage you to go back to the start of this video where I just had the bids listed and try and redo the problem for yourself. So go back, pause the video, try and redo the problem and figure out what amount each person is paying out, what amount each person is taking in, and what the extra is without watching along as I do it, and that will help prepare you to do the homework problems.